Hi, welcome to another one of my videos, but this time in 2025. How exciting. It's weirdly that time of the year again, or probably a month past that time of the year, where I review all the books that I've read in the past year. I actually exceeded my own expectations of how many books I would read in 2024 because I knew it was going to be a busy year. There was a lot on my plate. I had very low expectations for how much I would read, and in saying so, I'm really proud of how much I've actually managed to read. I think I read like 21 books or something like that, so pretty good achievement for someone who was really busy. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, some mixed thoughts, and some things I just... no words. Also, this year I started using Goodreads. Like, I've always had a Goodreads account, but I've just finally started using it. That's been an interesting process for me as well. There's a lot more social dynamics to it than I thought with my friends, and sometimes I'll see them add things to their lists from things I've read in my reviews, and that's so strange. I feel very perceived. I do have a cup of tea with me to get me through this because it is really cold. It looks really cute and cozy and vibey, but it's very cold in this flat and heating is so expensive, so we're trying to cut down. I have invested in a heated blanket now, so that tides me through during the night, and during the day I have endless cups of tea. I actually hate tea, like rooibos or black tea or anything like that. I am more a herbal kind of girl, so I drink green tea as well. Green tea is nice, but this actually, it's a licorice and mint tea. I've never found that combination in the UK, so anytime I visit my partner in Paris, I just like import boxes back. They probably think I've got like some tea smuggling ring going on. I would highly recommend, if you find yourself in France or if you see this type of tea anywhere else in Europe, get yourself licorice and mint tea. It is the best thing, especially if you let it brew for a long time. It's so strong and so good. Like, I know I sound insane. Everyone hates like long brewed tea, but I'm like, leave it in for an hour. Leave it in at least an hour, and then you will taste heaven. Trust me. Let's get into it. The very first book that I read this year was Clytemnestra, Starting Strong. As you may recall from my previous book video, I got super into Greek mythology, like super into it in 2023, and that trend continued for a good portion of 2024. Honestly, I had really high expectations for this book because I'd seen such amazing reviews. I feel like it didn't disappoint at all. It exceeded all expectations, if that's even possible. I've really been loving the feminist retellings of all these Greek mythology stories, and I really look forward to seeing how this kind of trope of like retellings will come out in other types of mythology, because I've learned I'm just a mythology girl, and it doesn't have to be Greek mythology, although I feel I'm very well read in the matter, but I'd love to start exploring other types of mythology. Like ancient Egyptian mythology is also so fascinating to me. When I went to Egypt, I was just like, tell me everything, tell me all the lore. So anyway, back to Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is the daughter of one of the Greek kings. She gets married off kind of against her will to this really shitty guy who does not deserve to breathe a single breath, in my opinion. Agamemnon. Very famous man. He was involved in the battle in Troy. He kind of led the war to Troy. Terrible guy. Don't want to spoil too much, but like a lot of it is already known, like sacrifices their daughter to the gods to please them, to bring the wind, so that they can sail to Troy. Like, there's some unforgivable shit, like really unforgivable. You really thought you could just come home after all that? Anyway, it's a really interesting book told from a variety of perspectives, but I really loved how nuanced the characters of Clytemnestra and her sister Helen, Clytemnestra's children also, like how each character has such a specific personality. First of all, just the shit that a lot of them go through is, a lot of the time you're just like, are you okay? Like, I think you just need to be hugged for a very long time. You can like so completely understand where all of them are coming from, and you have so much empathy for a lot of the characters. I mean, one of the lines in the summary or like synopsis is like, if power isn't given to you, you have to take it for yourself. And it's really just about her reclaiming her own power after being forced into all these awful positions and being made to comply with this man she does not agree with at all, and for him to kind of strip away her entire life that she had led for her, that she had created for herself, and force her almost into like this forced confinement to be his wife and to perform all these wifely duties. Like, it's also just very relatable, like that feminine rage inside of you. Because I read this at the beginning of the year, I had to like read like my comments on my to remember what my thoughts were. I think honestly the only complaint that I really had was that there were way too many descriptive words used for Aegisthus, like way too many. And I mean, if that's my only complaint, it's pretty minor and it shows it's a really good book, but I don't know why there's multiple things like that that really annoy me in books. Like I really pick up on certain things, and that was something I really picked up, was like, okay, I think we get it, like, and we don't need some sort of adjective or descriptive word every time we use Aegisthus's name or every time he says something. Like, I don't know, it just felt like overdone. I really enjoyed this book. Like I said, I was super into feminist retellings of Greek mythology, and still am, and it was very well executed, like one of the best executed books I read in this genre. And I also just loved that we're giving women who didn't necessarily have a voice, even like fictional women, I love that we're giving these women a voice and portraying them in a more nuanced way. So that's Clytemnestra by Constanza Casati, and I would give this book 5 out of 5. Easy. The next book I read was Emma. I actually got this for my birthday from my partner. I've been wanting to read this book for ages. I watched the movie actually, and that's what made me want to read the book, and I found the movie very funny and very enjoyable, so I was like, you know what, let's give the book a try. So for those who don't know, Emma is about a young woman called Emma Woodhouse. She's like described as beautiful, as spoiled, and as irresistibly witty. She's kind of like a meddler in people's lives. She has a passion for meddling in people's lives, the inhabitants of the village, and kind of plays matchmaker, but it just never goes well. Like, she's always like, I know best, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I don't think a single thing she did actually worked out. But yeah, kind of messy vibes. But yeah, I really enjoyed the book. I found the dry sense of humor really funny, and like obviously the author was very self-aware about the fact that Emma was kind of an asshole at times, and I enjoy that. Okay, my comments on this book, and the reason I couldn't give it 5 stars was because what the fuck was that age difference? You've had 200 years to read this book, so I don't want to spoil too much, but like, get with the program. Literally, the character who turns out to be the main love interest towards the end of the book said that he had admired her and found her beautiful and liked her since she was 13, since he was in his when she was 13, he was in his 20s. He was a grown man. Why are you looking at a child like that? Kind of feels like a groomer, some might say. And yes, it's a different time, but regardless of the time, like, she was an immature 13-year-old and he was in his 20s, and he's admired her and liked her and wanted to be with her since then. That doesn't feel very good to me. Some might say romantic, I say we should probably call the police. Anyway, I did enjoy the book a lot. I really enjoyed all the meddlings and all the like petty drama and like making up a whole narrative. Like, Emma just makes up a whole narrative in her head about how things are, and it's so delusional, and I'm like so there for it. And I really enjoyed that aspect. I thought it was like very funny, and you could always just see like, this is gonna go so wrong. And I really enjoyed like kind of how she learned as well. Like, as she went through the book, she was like, oh, my actions actually have consequences. This is so bizarre. The way she slowly realized and changed her mannerisms was quite realistic. That was Emma by Jane Austen, and I would give it 4 out of 5. I missed the 5 because there is grooming involved. Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. This was my one and only non-fiction book of the year. Go me. I probably should read more non-fiction books. I just really struggle with that. I love a little escapism. I love a little fantasy, or just something to immerse myself in, and non-fiction is like, you can't be immersed. What? Immersed in what? The real world in which you're living. The book is divided into chapters, and it kind of covers how in different regions, different countries, different continents, I guess, political decisions and policy making is often actually really constrained by geography. Mountains, rivers, seas can really change how countries interact with one another and how countries themselves function. The author kind of uses this to understand certain events that are happening in countries, why people are the way they are. Like, the book tries to consider like the history of those countries as well as the present day of where those countries stand politically, geographically, and like kind of overall what this means. Like, yeah, it's a lot. He also tries to provide like kind of like a future roadmap, some sort of projection like as to where that country's going or where the region's going, which is quite interesting. Obviously not always accurate, but very interesting. My thoughts on the book: it did take me a painfully long time to finish this book, and that is on me. Like, I struggle so much with reading nonfiction, and the problem is I'm studying social policy, and so normally I read before I go to bed, and I don't really want to talk about geopolitical affairs or read about geopolitical affairs right before I go to bed, when I've spent my entire day studying policy and politics. And also I feel like I can't really process the information because I get really sleepy when I'm reading in bed, and I feel like it's hitting me with all these facts, and I'm like, I am not in the headspace to be like processing this and actually understanding what he's trying to say. So it took me a while I don't know if I want to divulge how long, but a long time to read this book. Okay, I'll start with the negatives first. I understand that this book is trying to talk about like kind of the power that countries have as well, and how that comes into play in terms of certain decisions. But I did think it was absolutely ridiculous that there was in each chapter got 20 pages, and the first few chapters were like China, Russia, the US, sure. Then there was one chapter, 20 pages, on Africa. Now, I'm from South Africa, and I thought that was absolutely ridiculous. Like, I know a lot of African countries don't hold a lot of political weight internationally, but I think there's so much to cover. There's so much going on, like, geopolitically in Africa, and there's so much, like, to consider and to factor in, and each country has such a very specific like political position in which they're in. And I would have thought that I was like so excited to get to that chapter, like speaking more about these countries, and I just felt it was very surface level. There were some useful insights. Like, I thought something that was quite interesting was like most of the issues going on in like Africa today are because of colonial legacies. So because of how like the US, the UK, the Portuguese, the French, how they decided to like divide these territories when they were colonizing, like didn't factor in different tribal groups, different like insular states. It didn't factor in how people had naturally divided themselves. It just like divided them straight down the middle sometimes, or like made up their own little boundaries. And it led to people being in a country, made up country, where they were completely different, spoke a different language, had different beliefs, cultures, whatever, to everyone else in the country. And obviously that can lead to a lot of conflict and to oppression of certain groups. And that is why still today certain countries are having like internal conflicts, civil wars, eugenics type cullings, because people were forced together when and told that they're one country and one united thing, and all these rules and laws and political statements are imposed on them when it doesn't necessarily reflect their history and their culture and their language. And there's always, if there's like multiple tribes or multiple groups, there's always going to be conflict when only one of them rises to power and everyone else is like kind of oppressed. I agreed with that, and I thought that was an interesting reasoning, and he gave some really useful examples, but a lot of it just felt very vague, and we were jumping from country to country like by paragraph, and I was like, how can you just write like a 4-liner paragraph on one country? And so many countries obviously didn't even get mentioned, and I thought that was a huge shame. There's so much to think about. I'm in the UK studying, and we don't get to learn about like anything outside of Europe a lot of the time, and a lot of the research is very Eurocentric, so I was excited for a fresh perspective, and I just felt it didn't deliver. So anyway, sorry, I'm harping on. He did the same with South America, and I was like, I don't like that either. Like, I don't know. I understand, like, you can't write about every single nation. You can't write about 195 countries. That's not possible. It didn't hit right. It's like, if you can't dedicate that much time to it, rather pick a few select countries than just say Africa. Go into greater depth with those countries that you feel more comfortable talking about. I did learn a lot. I did find it very informative. I think there was an expectation almost to have like a predefined knowledge of certain events. Like sometimes he would just offhandedly mention like, oh, this event, and then there's no explanation, and you're like, but what happened in the Philippines on that exact date? I don't know. It did sometimes need like some own personal research, because I think sometimes you're expected to just know things. Like I said, I really did like how he linked like a lot of issues today to like a post-colonial legacy, which I think is very true. That was The Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, and I would give that also a 4 out of 5. Very interesting, very informative, very well written. He's clearly an incredibly intelligent and experienced man. He's been all over the place and has like 40 years of experience. And I actually went to a book signing of his, and I bought another book of his, which I have yet to read, but it's called The Future of Geography, and he even signed it. Look at that. So yeah, so I will read that at some point, but I think I had my full. The next book I read was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. I got bought this book also for my birthday by my flatmate and one of my best friends. She's a huge Agatha Christie head, like absolutely. It's her favorite author. If you ask her anything about Agatha Christie, she will talk to you for hours. So when she found out I'd never read her, she was like, you must immediately read Agatha Christie. So she got me this book because it was one of her favorites, and apparently it's considered one of Christie's like masterpieces. So Yeah, it's set in a little village in England. Perspective or like narrative is delivered by the village doctor, and his name's Dr. Shepherd. A wealthy widower, Roger Ackroyd, ends up getting murdered in his home, and there's a slew of suspects, and so Dr. Shepherd ends up actually helping Poirot, the detective, with solving this murder. Yeah, honestly, my favorite character in this book was the doctor's sister. She loved a good gossip. She was like way more intelligent than I think the doctor gave her credit for, and she was just so funny. Like anytime she featured, I would laugh at something she said. It's becoming apparent there's a very specific type of character I enjoy. Honestly, I thought it was a bit predictable. Like I kind of foresaw where it was going very early on. I think maybe it was like quite revolutionary and shocking for its time, but I've seen this trope many times now. Obviously, I guess because it's been rehashed many times. Yeah, so in that sense, I wouldn't say I was like shocked and gagged at the ending. I really enjoyed the humor. I thought the writing was super compelling. Like I flew through it in 2 days, I think. Honestly, the one part I really didn't like was Poirot at some point supports the idea of the murderer killing themselves, because the murderer is like, I've brought shame and dishonor to my family, I must end my life and instead of going to prison. And Poirot's like, yeah, that sounds right, yeah, you probably should do that. Yeah, I didn't like that. I thought that probably wasn't morally correct. Like I don't know if there's some sort of like moral conduct that private detectives are meant to adhere to, but that just didn't feel right. Like I didn't like that at all, and I was like, that's a strange thing for someone who's meant to be like the good character to support. I think it's really good if you want a trusty murder mystery. I've never been a huge murder mystery person, so it was interesting to read the genre, and I definitely enjoyed it. Take my criticism with a grain of salt for some of it, because I think I am a bit more critical of murder mysteries. Like I think it has to be really crazy for me to be very impressed. So that was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, and I would give it also a 4 out of 5. Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, another Greek mythology retelling. It's about Medusa. She's the only mortal in a family of gods, and she's the youngest amongst the Gorgon sisters, so she's a Gorgon. One day, really sadly, if you don't know the story, she actually gets assaulted in Athena's temple by Poseidon, and Athena can't punish Poseidon because he's a very strong, powerful god, and so instead of punishing him for kind of desecrating her temple, she decides to take it out on Medusa, because of course take that out on the woman who is the victim, sure. And she turns her hair into like a nest of snakes, which turn any thing, like living thing she looks at, to stone. And then on the other side, like the other POV, we see Perseus, who is a young man who's been told to bring back the head of the Gorgon to free his mother, basically, from being forced into marriage. The king was like, well, if you bring me the head of one of the Gorgons, I won't marry your mother, and I'll leave you guys in peace to live your fishing village life that you're dreaming for yourself. That's kind of the like plot, and it kind of goes from there as like Perseus is on his journey to go hunt Medusa, and Medusa's trying to learn to live with this kind of monstrosity on her head, I guess, and not wanting to hurt living things, not wanting to hurt her sisters. Honestly, I really love this book. I flew through it so quickly. I love the concept of a historically perceived hero like Perseus being kind of challenged while reflecting on like all the injustices done to women who are victimized and then villainized. Yeah, honestly, like the story just made me really sad for Medusa. Like she had such a rough life, and I felt so like, God, she just can't get a break. She just wants to go experience the world. And it was a really good book. I thought it was very powerful and very enjoyable. You even get like a POV of like Medusa's head after it's been severed, which is crazy. I feel like it did add like some depth. Like every POV had a purpose. Like it wasn't just for shock value. A 5 out of 5 from me. Next, I read Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is a very long book, so I will try to summarize very briefly. But basically, Robin, the main character, is orphaned by cholera in Canton in China. He has like a sponsor who saves him called Professor Lovell, and he takes him back to London with him. And he kind of wants to train him up in Latin, ancient Greek, and Chinese to be able to go to Oxford when he's old enough to enroll at Oxford University and go to the Royal Institute of Translation. And like, to the professor, this boy's like kind of an investment for him. Now, this Royal Institute of Translation is also known as Babel. And this is where it gets interesting, because up until this point, it very loyally sticks to 1830s setting, like in London or in the UK, but there's like elements of magic mixed in. So there's something called like silverworking, which you kind of figure out as you go, like how it works, but it's difficult to explain. But kind of, if you can connect like almost a lost word or lost interpretation or meaning of a word with a different word from a different language, that like they kind of blend, they kind of work together. And you engrave these on silver bars, you can cause magic. So basically a word in ancient Farsi for fast or quick-footed, combined with another word for speedy wagon or whatever in another language, and you put those on a silver bar on either side, and then you attach that bar to a wagon, that wagon's going to go like 10 times faster. So it almost like accelerates, it improves, it heals, it like there's lots of different properties and like outputs that these bars can have. And so the purpose of the translation unit like Babel is to discover new words and put together new words and use their languages of specialization to be able to bring more to the table, more options. In the UK, this has served them super well because they were then very powerful and they could use this craft to kind of power through with their colonization attempts, which is great. So for Robin, like this was like his dream to go to Oxford. Like he was primed for it. He was like literally primed since he was like 7. And so he was so excited to go. As he gets there and he meets some people, like part of this sort of revolution, he starts to realize like serving Babel kind of means betraying where he came from, China, because they were getting super fucked over by the UK, or like Britain, I guess is probably the better word. As he like continues to study, he starts to get torn between like this like idealistic life he had for himself. You're just a cushy researcher when you qualify, and like, you know, there's an amazing future for him and he can travel the world and learn all these languages. It sounds very exciting. So he's kind of torn between that future that he'd always imagined for himself and like the revolutionary, like they call themselves the Hermes Society, who are fighting against what Britain is trying to do, kind of dedicated to stopping imperial expansion. So anyway, that's kind of where it goes, and then it just it goes way further than that. But for me, like it took me a while to understand how the magic worked. I feel like even when I'm trying to explain it, I'm like like it makes sense in my head, but it's quite tricky to explain. But once I did, like honestly, I adore the concept. I adored this book. I loved the constant references to etymology. I learned so much I've forgotten, but I learned so much about the history of certain words and the connections between different words in different languages, what influence, like some languages influenced other languages and their terminology for certain things, and it's just fascinating. I think there was like such a powerful investigation of like the idea of knowledge as power and language as power, and I think that's so true. It also like dug into the concept of like unequal relationships between third world countries and imperial states, and how even now like you can see a lot of parallels with modern day, and like how post-colonial powerful states, how much more knowledge they still have over certain third world countries. I also lived for the 4 friends because Robin has 3 friends who are in the same cohort as him when he comes to Oxford. Each of them has a very unique experience in how imperial expansion impacts them and the types of oppression that they feel, either as a woman or a woman of color or a man of color. Like they all have very unique perspectives, and you can kind of empathize with all of them. You can understand why all of them react the way they do. Yeah, I think some parts of it I did find a bit queerbaity, and I was like, I almost feel like certain aspects were included for shock value than actually to tackle the concept, because other topics that were like taboo at the time, like interracial couples, like that was tackled quite head on. The queer aspects weren't, and it was almost like hinted at, and it did kind of feel like shock value for certain like outcomes of events, and I don't know, I'm never a big fan of that if that's how you're going to do it. So I think that was my one minor gripe. But yeah, that was Babel. I would give it a 5 out of 5. I would give it a 6 out of 5 if I could. It was one of my favorite books this year. Just so good. Then there was Penelope by Margaret Atwood. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I didn't like this book. Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, resides on the island of Ithaca while he goes away to Troy for like 10 years, and then he's gone for like another like 5-10 years because he gets lost and goes through all these crazy things. And so it's meant to like portray what her life was like. And in faithful retellings, she's always been seen as like this faithful wife, this like very sage and like resolute woman, like, and she's just trying to raise her son by herself. But because Odysseus has gone so long, she has like all these suitors, like 100 men come to try and marry her so they can like take control of Ithaca, and she's like trying to put them all off, and she has her maids, kind of 12 maids, like kind of serving as spies for her. And so these 12 maids, I think it's 12, I'm pretty sure it's 12, like sleep with these men but also spy on them, and like very faithful to Penelope. And then when Odysseus comes back, he actually hangs all of them, because he sees them as betraying him for sleeping with suitors who were trying to steal his place. That's the story of like what happens. And from Margaret Atwood's book, she's trying to give these 12 dead maids a voice and also consider another alternative to how Penelope could have been acting and thinking during this time, and like I guess give her more of a realistic voice compared to like how she's portrayed as like this very chaste wife. I thought that was exciting because I love these types of retellings, and it was meant to be a feminist retelling, but I just found it a bit disappointing. And I don't know if that's because it was one of the first retellings. This was published in like 1999. It's like it was one of the first attempts at feminist retellings, to the best of my knowledge, for Greek mythology. I think it's definitely a product of its time, and I think it was very highly regarded back then. When I read it now compared to other retellings I've read, I found it very disappointing. I thought it would be a lot more in depth. I didn't realize it was such a short story. Actually, it was only 120 pages. And I just really didn't like the voice of Penelope. I appreciated that Margaret was trying to like humanize her. And I definitely saw that come through because like, I agree, like she was always portrayed as this pious woman. But I did find like Margaret made her like almost went to the other side of the spectrum and made her act almost like a child, like a whiny, temper tantrumy child when she was in her 30s. And I just didn't feel like that was a very fair representation of Penelope. And I didn't like how Helen was portrayed either, because she was like portrayed as this like man-eater and not as like a victim of circumstance herself, and there was no like empathy or understanding for her. Penelope was also very haughty about Clytemnestra, and these are her cousins, by the way. Helen and Clytemnestra are Penelope's cousins, and so I just found that lack of female solidarity and understanding kind of disappointing. Like Penelope was just seemed very miserable and just tore a lot of women down and compared herself to the other women, almost resented Helen for who she was as a person. And I don't know, I think it's also because I had read Clytemnestra, so I had very specific visions in my mind of what these three characters all looked like, and they were much more nuanced and more detailed, and I really found them more realistic. And then to go to this, it felt like, I don't know, it didn't mesh with my brain. My brain just could not process it. And I think maybe if you hadn't read any other Greek mythology retellings and then read this book, you would probably actually really enjoy it. But I think for me, because I had all these preconceived ideas of what these characters were like, I was like, no, this doesn't feel right. I don't like this. I think the other thing that I felt a bit jarring was sometimes we jumped from like these events to like modern day, like modern day, or at least in 1990 something, and I found that very bizarre as well. Like I just felt like it took me out of the book a bit, and I do understand why she was doing that, like almost being like, oh look how far we've come, not. And I thought that was a valid point, but I still like, I don't know, I still struggled with it a bit. So that's that. I would give it a 3 out of 5. I know, my lowest yet, but has to be done. Then there's a Cruel Prince series by Holly Black, and I read all 3 in quick succession, so I'll just summarize the first book. So story follows Jude, the main character. So initially when she's 7 and her sister I think is 9 or 10, they're just chilling at home and someone comes in and kills their parents, and it turns out he is a fairy, and when he realizes that there are children involved, he feels like obligated to take care of them, so he takes them with him to the High Court of Fairy to live with him, and he's going to raise them. And like, I don't know, to me, I would be very worried that when their children grow up they would kill me, but I think he was very confident in his ability to like brainwash them. 10 years later, both Jude and her sister have grown up in Fairy now. Jude loves it there, she's so happy to be there, successfully brainwashed, probably not going to kill her adopted father, but she has found it really hard because like the Fae really hate mortals, and because she's been going to school alongside them and everything, like her and her sister have not been treated very well, and she's convinced that like the only way for her to like gain respect in Fairy is to win a place in court, like potentially with the guard or in some sort of high held position where you have to be respected, and then she can prove herself like she's strong, she's not a weak human. And honestly, like props to her, because the way that these two sisters are treated, like they are so heavily bullied, and I just don't know if I would be able to summon up the will to want to stay in a place like this and prove myself to these awful people. So honestly, props to her, like she's very dedicated and determined to this life of hers. Anyway, so in the first book, that's kind of the trajectory, and she ends up making a deal with one of the princes. Following this, she has to work closely with Prince Carden, who is the person who bullied her the most majority of her life. He is so awful to her and so like just so cruel prince. There we go. She has to work alongside him to kind of get what she wants. Yeah, that's kind of where the first book starts going, and then it just kind of flows from there. I wish I discovered this book when I was 15, like this series, because I think I would have died over this series. I was such a huge fantasy junkie back in the day. And I mean, even now that I'm reading this at 24, I still thoroughly enjoyed it. Like I really loved it. It was such a easy read, but there was also such really interesting like reflection on like the functions of power, and also the main character is really cool, like super badass. I think she was very logical, and she would do things where you're like, yeah, that makes sense, actually that is the best course of action. It was really good. Like no one really makes too many stupid decisions, and I really like that because it just makes everything a bit more enjoyable and realistic. It also definitely passed the Bechdel test because Judith's so set on her goals. She knows where she's going and she's fucking getting there no matter what. And even though there are like elements of romance, she's very true to herself and very set on what's right and what she wants to do, and isn't gonna let like romance get in the way of that. And I respect that so much. I think it was actually very good. You know how I was like, oh, I pick up small things about books that really annoy me? I did find that Holly Black would reuse certain descriptive words or phrases a lot, and that kind of annoyed me. Like one that I really clearly remember is the phrase hectic flush. Like he had a hectic flush spread across her cheeks. Like, oh yeah, just that phrase was used so much, but there were a lot of phrases that were heavily reused. Yeah, so it's one of those things that when you see it, you just can't unsee it, and you're like, oh my god, please, Holly, think of a different descriptor. It is a solid fairy tale if you're looking for one, and the world building is just so good, very nuanced. I loved it. So I would give that a 5 out of 5. My Dark Vanessa by Elizabeth Russell. This follows a teenage girl who is actually groomed by her teacher, but obviously it's not described as that from her perspective. It's kind of a love story for her, and it kind of flicks back between her experience as a teenager and her now, when she's in her late 20s in adulthood, when the groomer, the teacher called Jacob Strain, he's actually accused of sexually assaulting another student of his, and she's starting to have to actually challenge her own beliefs and her own thoughts of the situation and reflect back on it. She kind of has to make a choice, like does she want to say something or will she remain silent, as she has been for the past like 10 years. It's a huge thing to overcome. Like she has to within herself like recognize like, oh, this man didn't love me, he was using me and manipulating me. And it's a very powerful read. Like I found it so awful, but also you can so understand how men in positions of power, especially over young girls, or any like teacher in like any sort of person in a position of power over children, like how easy it is to manipulate them. And you can, when you're reading the chapters, like you can see how he says things to her like, you're just so mature, you're so this, you're so that. And when you're that age, like you're not going to critically think about that most of the time. You're going to be like, yeah, I'm actually. And it's so, you can see how insidious it is, how it like drip feeds through until like you're isolated and under the control of this person. I think it really captured like the double standards and the adultification of teenage girls, and how like grooming can warp your thoughts and your understanding of the world like long term. Like she's in her late 20s and still reckoning with the idea that like, oh, maybe it wasn't love. And you can see how like easily this situation can happen. I just think it's a really important novel for even younger audiences to at least understand and at least then be able to recognize the signs of someone who's trying to manipulate them. I think it's just so important to protect young children from this, and I think it happens way more than you would even think. So yeah, very good, very powerful, 5 out of 5. Really enjoyed it. The next book was Chronicle in Stone by Ismail Kadara. Ismail Kadara is an Albanian author, like one of the most famous ones. I know he is quite contentious within Albania because he was seen to abandon the country in their time of need during communism when the waters started getting a bit hot for him, and betrayed a few people. And so I know a lot of Albanian people aren't very proud of him or very happy for him. So I just thought I'd put that out there. Like, I know he's not like the most amazing man in the world, but he is one of the only Albanian authors who's actually translated into English, would you believe? So I read this book when I was in Albania, when I was in Shirakaste, because his that's his hometown, and I actually saw his house, or like his house was actually rebuilt, but newly rebuilt version of his house, and it made me really interested to maybe read some of the literature from that time. And so yeah, I picked up Chronicle and Stone, and it's meant to be kind of a coming of age story. It actually reminded me a lot of Boy in Striped Pajamas, like capturing like a very intense, traumatizing period of time, but through the eyes of a child who's very innocent and doesn't always understand why things are happening the way they're happening. So it's based during World War II, and this young boy is having to experience war within Jericho, and how this impacts the social dynamics of the town, how this impacts like who comes through the town. He witnesses like invasions and bombings and infighting. It's one of those stories where like he'll say something from his perspective and you're meant to perceive it as something else. He'll missee something or misunderstand something, and then you're meant to piece together what actually happened and derive that just from like his kind of skewed point of view. I thought it was such a well written book. Ismail really loves metaphors, loves them, but actually I didn't find it tiring. I found it actually kind of added to the story, and added to that childlike wonder and always seeing things in other things, like this is the massive mouth of the well and the well talks back to me, and like that kind of like very vivid imagination of a young child. And I thought it just captured the essence of the boy really well. I also found out a couple of fun facts about this book when I read it. Was that Ismail Kadara rewrote this book several times after it went to print, so each time it was being reprinted it was like a whole different version, because he was like a bit of a perfectionist and just wanted to keep changing or editing bits. The other interesting thing was that Albania was actually the only country to free itself of German occupation during World War II by itself without any external aid. So that's pretty impressive and pretty cool. 5 out of 5. Yes, for me. He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan. So I read the first book, She Who Became the Sun, a year and a half ago, and I loved it so much, so much. It's set in, I think, the 13th Chinese dynasty, and it is amazing. It once again follows the same characters. So Shu Yuanzhang, who is kind of leading the rebels, like her goal is to overthrow the king and become the new Radiant King. And I don't want to give too much away because a lot of what happens in this book follows on from what happened in the first book. So it's an amazing book. It's really well written. The plot is so elaborate, the stakes are so high, and everything that could go wrong does go wrong, and it is just heartbreaking, but like just so impressive, like how resilient the characters are, especially Shu. Shu is like so resilient. All the various forms of queerness and the acknowledgement of different identities and how these fit together, and it's just chef's kiss. Honestly, chef's kiss, so good. Yeah, my love for this duology knows no bounds, honestly. I talked about it so much that my boyfriends actually started reading the first book or listening to the audiobook of the first book. So yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail because I think it'll ruin things, but check out the duology if you can. Blood in the Mist by Herb Mirrlees is next. So this is kind of set in a fantastical world. Blood in the Mist is the capital city of a small country called Dormer. To the west of Blood in the Mist, the capital city, is Fairyland. Fairyland is seen as kind of this like morally corrupt place, and there's particularly because there's this fruit called fairy fruit that comes from there, and when you eat it as a human, it kind of makes you a bit silly, you go a bit crazy, you can become quite addicted to it. It's almost like drugs. It's basically like drugs for humans. You get high from it, like it has a lot of repercussions for humans, and so it became a crime to eat fairy fruit or to import fairy fruit or be seen with it. So the current mayor of the town, Nathaniel Chanticleer, notices that his son has started to act a bit strange, and his son then says, well, I've had fairy fruit, and so he sends his child away to a random farm, but has to deal with this problem and realizes it's coming in from somewhere, and it gets very convoluted and very complicated, and there are a lot of different characters. It's very airy-fairy, like some of the laws of this city make no sense, but it's so interesting because it's like so much of it feels almost very ridiculous, like how the city functions and what some of the rules are, but I find it all adds to the storytelling, and I think the world building is just insane. It's very compelling. Hope has literally written an entire constitution almost. Like, something to know about this book is it actually was the book that inspired Neil Gaiman to write Stardust. So that's actually kind of why I started reading it, because I was really interested to know. I read Stardust the year before and I was really interested to know what it was about this book that inspired him, and he always like really highly praised it. But honestly, the prose was beautiful. I thought it described the thoughts and actions of characters in such a way that it speaks to a wider human experience. Like there were so many times that they would say something and I'd be like, yeah, that's so true. Like there's one scene where Nathaniel is like in a graveyard and he's looking at a gravestone of a baker who lived like 80 years, and it's like, led a lovely life, like had 3 amazing children, and the way it describes his life is just so wow, yeah, it does sound like a lovely life. Sounds like very calm and very relaxed, and like he had a very fulfilling life. And Nathaniel's just like, damn, I wish I had that life. I want what he had. That sounds so nice. It sounds like he didn't have a worry in the world. And I think that I just found that so relatable, because it was like, we're the only ones who know like the anxiety and stress and dread or whatever that we feel inside of us. And so of course you're going to look at others' lives or hear about someone, you've seen the trajectory of their life, and you can like be like, oh, I'd love to live that life, because you know the trajectory of their entire life. But for you, everything feels very uncertain, and you feel anxious and stressed sometimes, and you feel the weight of life in a way that you can't see in others. Like it always looks like others are often leading easier lives than you. I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but I just found that very relatable, because I think that is the case so much of the time. And I just thought that was really profound. Yeah, anyway, so I would rate this book honestly a 5 out of 5. I mean, even the female characters, for the time, it was published in the 1920s, I think for the time they actually were pretty developed. The Vegetarian by Hong Kong. So this book is based in Korea, in South Korea. It's about a woman called Young Hye who lives with her husband an ordinary life, and then she starts having these really awful dreams that kind of torture her, and she decides one day her like husband wakes up and there's just all this meat on the floor, and she's decided like, no, I'm going vegetarian, like this isn't happening. This decision, kind of like her first like kind of independent decision about her own life, like her own autonomy, changes her entire life. Like it impacts her marriage, it impacts her relationship with her family, and it kind of sets into motion this chain of events that become more and more grotesque, and you kind of get this feeling that everyone is trying in some way or other to control her or give her some label or understand her. Yeah, it just starts like, it goes from, oh, this is normal and understandable, to like completely crazy and very bizarre, and it does not go in the direction that you would think it would go in. It's like a very, very dark novel, and from my interpretation, it's like a metaphor of someone trying to break free from the violence around them and also within them. Like she goes through some awful stuff and is really mistreated by the people around her. My first thought when I started reading this book was, damn, this is very relatable, because I was a vegetarian when I was in South Korea, and yeah, it was really hard and people treat you really weird. And even though there is a word in Korean for vegetarian, cheshikjuja, like people are still like, what? So you eat chicken? So can I give you fish? And they get so confused. Like it's just like culturally it's just not a thing, and it's still a hugely new concept to be vegetarian there. I found it so hard to find vegetarian options for me. Obviously in Seoul it's better, but I was in Busan and there were 3 vegetarian vegan places in the whole city, and if you go to a normal restaurant, like it is impossible to not have meat. Like once I even had my Korean friend there and he ordered tofu stew for me and emphasized I was vegetarian, and it still came with like lumps of beef in it, and I was like, that's not even my fault, I didn't order that. I thought that was really relatable and interesting, and how people are always just like very confused if you're vegetarian. They're like, but why? Like I don't understand why. And so that kind of came across a lot in the first bit, and like how people were reacting to her being vegetarian was like, yeah, so bad. I've experienced this. So I really enjoyed that. Then it took a turn and it started getting weirder, and I no longer related, but I still found it so interesting. I think it was really interesting how the misogyny and the treatment of women is really directly linked to like nature, and how nature is also mistreated and animals are mistreated. The writing style is amazing. The passages are just absolutely gorgeous, and I ate this book up in 1.5 days, also just because I wanted to understand what the hell was going on. And I don't think you ever really get the answers you want, but it is so powerful, and honestly I would 100% recommend this book. It's so weird but so worth it, and I feel like you come away being like, I need to stare into space for an hour and then I need to Google a lot of things. It's one of those books. I would give that book 5 out of 5 for sure. Then we have A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. This book is much lighter. So there is Cordelia, who is a young woman, I think she's 14 or 15, and she lives with her mother, and she knows her mother's like very strange. Her mother's very controlling, honestly bordering on abusive. Like they're not allowed to have closed doors in the house, she's not allowed to leave the house, she doesn't have any friends except for her mom's white horse Falada. Her mom is able to do something which is really strange. She can actually control Cordelia's mind. She has the ability to make Cordelia obedient, and so Cordelia will have periods of time, like for a few hours to a few days to a few weeks, where she is made completely obedient and almost like the puppet of her mother. So everyone in town thinks she's just like this well-behaved kid, and she can never actually express herself or be herself or ask for help. And she slowly starts to realize, oh, my mother might be a sorcerer. Then after a bit of a murdering mishap, her mother is like, we need to get out of here, and also I need to find a rich suitor who I can marry myself to and have a good life. So she tracks down this wealthy older man called the Squire, kind of makes him her target, and they very quickly get themselves invited to stay in his manor for a few weeks. Unlucky for them, with the Squire lives his older sister Hester, who is my favourite character. She's so cool. And so while Cordelia's mother is trying to lure the Squire into marriage, Hester is kind of like trying to solve the mystery of like who the fuck these people are. She doesn't trust them. And then she's like also trying to figure out whether Cordelia is in on her whole mother's scam, or whether she's an innocent victim who needs to be helped. It's just such a great book. Like, Hester is just so relatable, and I love that she plays into the whole, I'm just like a 50-year-old duddy old woman, my knees hurt, I have arthritis, I can't do anything, like in front of Cordelia's mother. But in the meantime, it's like hatching a billion plans, and like so intelligent, so smart, and I love her so much. She's an icon. I thought it was a great use of POVs, hopping between Cordelia and Hester. I was really invested in all the characters. It was quite dark because it is actually a retelling of The Goose Girl by the Grimm brothers. So obviously their fairy tales were very dark, and this actually is quite a dark retelling. It's very fun and very interesting, but it's quite gruesome, a bit dark, a bit somber. But I think it really stayed true to its roots and was just so good. I loved it so much. I really enjoyed it. Obviously 5 stars. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. This is kind of a 90s sci-fi. Deep underground, there are 40 women imprisoned in a cage, and they're guarded by 2 guards constantly. They don't know how they got there. They have no notion of time, no way of telling time, but they know they've been there probably about 15 years. They have a vague recollection of what their lives were like before, like normal life, but that's about it. Amongst these women is a young girl, and they think it's maybe a mistake that she ended up there because all the other women are like fully grown women. But there's a young girl who's like, I would say maybe 4 or 5 when she comes into the cage, when they're all put in the cage. And so she grows up only knowing the cage. She doesn't have any memories from before coming here. And as she gets older, she starts to question more things that like the women had kind of given up on questioning. They were just kind of like beaten into submission in a way, and they just kind of accepted their life and like tried to get by. But as she grew up, she was like, but why? Like, I don't understand. What was this like? Why are we here? I want to understand. And initially everyone's like, would you shut the fuck up? But like the more she questions, the more she starts to like try to understand things. And one day she's watching the guards, observing them, and an alarm goes off, and they drop their keys as they're about to put food into the cage and run out and never come back. And so that's kind of weird. As obviously the women all take the opportunity to escape and get out and leave the bunker and hope to find safety and salvation, and they get above ground and they don't know where they are. They're in a very strange place. No one recognizes it. It's very like they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and they decide to walk and to try find a city, find something. It kind of goes from there, like as they're trying to find more life, find someone else. Unfortunately, like a few days into walking, they actually find another bunker just like theirs, with also 40 women, but all the women are dead because when they were abandoned, they didn't have the keys and they were still in the cage and they starved to death. The women start to think, oh, there's more to this than we thought, and it kind of goes from there. This is such an interesting book. It kind of covers like female friendship and intimacy, how people try to maintain their humanity in the face of like devastation. First of all I wrote was just, what the fuck? Like literally what the fuck. I think initially I was really focused on the mystery part, like really trying to understand, like, yeah, where are they? What's going on? Why are all these like bunkers here? Why are they all abandoned? What's happening? But I think the point is to not know, because you're seeing from the perspective of the young girl as she develops, like she's not meant to know, so you're not meant to know, kind of thing. There's a lot of reflection on identity and what it means to be human and life purpose, and it also really felt like the main character was maybe a representative of an autistic person, just based on how she was written. Like she's always felt separate, felt different. She doesn't feel human. She doesn't feel the same types of desire for intimacy, and she really enjoys being alone, and she has some very specific obsessions. Yeah, I thought she was a very interesting character. It was a very heavy read, a bit on the futility of life, and it just left me staring at the ceiling at night thinking about my life's purpose. And also, obviously, because she's the youngest, if all the other women slowly die of old age, she will be left alone, and that also comes into play. And it's one of those questions where if no one else witnesses you exist, do you exist? Like those kind of philosophical questions. And it's very interesting. 5 out of 5. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by Victoria E. Schwab. So the book starts in France in 1719 in a really tiny village, and there's a young woman who it's honestly so relatable because I felt like this growing up. She's like in a small town and is just not happy there, wants to explore the world, wants to see more, but she kind of feels trapped. She feels like stuck there. No one in the village has ever really left, and she knows she's probably destined for marriage. And one day her parents do decide, like, you are marrying this random man who she has no feeling for. And so on the day of her wedding, in a desperate attempt to kind of escape this life that she foresees for herself that she does not want, where she'll have to live in this village forever with this man she doesn't love and have children when she doesn't want children and live this whole life that's not really for her, she runs to the forest and buries like kind of like a sacrifice, like a ring, and tries to make a deal with the gods, like, to help her. Her neighbor had always taught her about like how to pray to the old gods, and like you pray to the old gods during the day. If you pray to the gods during the night, like the bad gods come out, like the ones you don't want to make a deal with. It's like that weird twilight area, and she's praying, and then it gets kind of dark, and then yeah, she ends up making a bargain with one of the bad gods. She makes a deal that she wants to live forever. She doesn't want to have to follow through with this life. She wants to be able to live life on her own terms, and it kind of comes out that she wants to live forever or as long as she wants until she decides she doesn't want to live anymore. The god kind of twists her words around, and he's like, oh yeah, I'll give you that, but what she learns is, like, if it's on her terms, she will not be remembered by anyone she ever meets. She's cursed to be forgotten. So as soon as she's out of sight of someone, they just forget her. They forget her ever meeting her, her name, anything. And she first realizes this when she goes home to see her family, and they just don't recognize her or remember her at all. That begins the life of Addie LaRue. That's her name. I didn't even say that in the beginning. Addie LaRue. It's even in the title. Her full name's Adeline, but she prefers Addie. You kind of follow her across the centuries, across different countries and continents. 300 years later in New York, she actually goes into a bookstore, and she's completely shocked because the man remembers her, and that's the first person who's ever remembered her in 300 years. And so you kind of see a parallel of younger and how she progressed, and then modern day, like now she's grappling with the fact that what does this mean that someone remembers her, and wanting to like have a relationship with this person who remembers her because it's the only person to ever know her for so long. Yeah, I love this book so much. I think the only thing I hated was the Goodreads comments, and that's just because, I don't know if it's just because I've gone to too much therapy. There was like the most intense shipping of Addie with the most unstable, toxic, violent demon, and I'm just like, literal demon, he was a demon, saying that they were disappointed in certain aspects, and I was just shocked, agog, gagged to read this. And simultaneously, in the same breath of saying that, they were like, oh, that one character was really boring because they had mental health issues. And I was just like, who are these people? Who are you? Like, why do you want this for her? Anyway, apart from that, I love the book. I think it was a really realistic approach to love and connection, because it's not perfect and it's not going to be like the most insane romance you've ever had, but it's about companionship, and that's really special. And the importance of being seen came through a lot, obviously, and I think it really connected with the book I read before, actually, I Who Have Never Known Men, and I found a lot of parallel themes and philosophical questions, which really like knocked me. I was like, oh my god, I am questioning my entire life. If no one bears witness to your life, if no one remembers you, do you exist? Does your life have meaning? Does it have importance? And what kind of mark can you leave in the world? And I really loved it, and I think it really feeds into that idea where it's like this intoxicating idea of like, yeah, it would be amazing to have all that time to do whatever you want and experience everything you want, but then like on the downside, you only half exist and you never truly get to experience what life has to offer because you don't get to build those connections with people. And I thought that was just such a well executed concept and very nuanced, and yeah, I've used that word so many times in this video, but yeah, really enjoyed it. So I would give that 100% 5 out of 5. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. So there's this couple, Mary and Leah. Leah goes on these like deep sea missions in submarines doing some sort of marine research. One time she goes away for an unplanned amount of time, like 6 months, and Mary thinks her wife is dead, and then she comes back and Mary's like, hell yeah, I thought you were dead. I thought you were gone forever. No one would tell me anything. And she's obviously really excited to have her back, but as soon as it becomes clear that Leah isn't like who she is normally, she's acting very strange. Whatever happened on that vessel while they were stranded in the submarine, like something's clearly changed and something's wrong. Even physically, she starts to look very unhealthy. Like things are happening that should not be happening. And Mary's like desperately trying to get them back to a normal life, and it starts becoming clear like that's just not going to be possible. And there's a lot of resentment there from Mary's side, and she's desperately trying to understand like why Leah is slipping out from her grasp and what's wrong. It kind of covers the idea of falling realistically, like falling in love, loss, grief, and a lot about the ocean. A lot of ocean facts that I did not expect to learn. Definitely creeped me out a little bit. But yeah, honestly, halfway most of the book I just kept thinking like, take her to a doctor, like oh my god, take her to a doctor. And I think I was reading into it too literally because I knew some things were meant to be metaphorical, but I was just like, oh my god, take her to the fucking doctor, what is wrong with you? But yeah, I think like kind of like I Who Have Never Known Men, like I was so focused on the mystery that I initially missed the philosophical aspects of it, and then like halfway through I was like, oh, I think I know what I'm meant to be picking up here. Yeah, so it was much more philosophical than I anticipated, but it was such a good book. I was very grossed out by some of the very vivid, gruesome descriptions, but honestly it's amazing. It really keeps you guessing until the end. So many themes were covered really well. The only thing I would say is that I really wish we would have had more of Leah's perspective from within the submarine, because maybe it would have detracted from the whole story, putting more focus on the mystery than the philosophical things, but I just would have loved to know a little bit more about her story down there. A lot of that time was just ocean facts, but yeah, it was good. I would give it a solid 4 out of 5. Okay, we're on the last book. Oh my god, I feel like I've been talking forever. A Memory Called Empire by Arcady Martin. I need to drink something. This is like an interplanetary sci-fi type book, very different from the things I normally read, but actually a booktuber I watch recommended it, and the more she spoke about it, the more I was like, this actually sounds like my kind of book. There is this entire empire, like interplanetary empire called the Teixeqalanli Empire, and this empire is like, they're everything. They own everything, they have everything, they control everything. Like they are a massive empire which includes a bunch of space stations, a bunch of planets, and they have all the resources, all the knowledge, all the power basically in the known galaxy, and they take what they want and kind of kill those who don't obey. So that's kind of the vibe of the empire. So the story follows Ambassador Mahit Samara, who is an ambassador for her space station. So the ambassador is summoned by the empire very randomly because her predecessor is dead, and no one will tell her that why he died. They say it was an accident, like food poisoning, but she's like, this seems kind of sus. So she's going into the empire kind of blind, not really knowing, like she's from a very small mining space station, so they don't have that much relevance within the empire, and she's not really sure what she's getting herself into, like why he was killed, if she's in danger. And she comes in during like a massive time of political instability, now has to figure out who's behind the murder, also save herself, also protect her station from Teixeqalanli expansion and control, because she's meant to be there to be protecting her station's interests, and a lot of what Teixeqalan wants to do is not in her station's interest at all, while also navigating like just being in this new place where she's literally considered a barbarian. Like she's called a barbarian, she's not from like the massive city. And there's one more thing actually very important that I actually forgot to mention, is she has this very special technological secret, and that is that all stationers, the people from her station, have what they call imager machines, which is like a little memory card that goes into your nervous system in the back of your neck. And because they only are 30,000 people, knowledge is very precious, and so they will try record people's lives and knowledge, so that when someone takes over from their role, they can give them this little card into their nervous system, and it's like you have a voice in your head telling you what to do. So they have a lot of pilots. They don't have time to like train all these pilots and train all these people. They just have this little card in. They suddenly have all the knowledge their predecessors had, how to use the plane, where to go, like almost like a visual map in their head of all the different destinations and planets. And it's kind of a really good way of like reusing and repurposing knowledge and protecting it and keeping it going throughout the generations. So she has her predecessor's chip in it, but he didn't come back to the station for 15 years. So there's only 5 years of information on there that they were able to update. And so she's going in very blind, because in theory she should have a lot more knowledge than she does, and she's having to go in with this kind of newbie in her head being like, woo, let's do this, and not the like wizened predecessor you want to have in your head. And I find that really funny actually. Like their dynamic is really funny, because although he's like trying to help, like he's also equally confused, like, I'm dead, I don't know why, I have no idea why. That aspect adds like a whole other element to how everything plays out as well. So yeah, usually I'm not the biggest sci-fi fan, but I was obsessed with this book. Like I already finished the sequel as well. I felt very confused in the beginning because there were a lot of terms and a lot of names that didn't make sense. All the people in the city, which is also known as the world, they have very strange names. They'll have, their first name will be a number and their last name will be some random noun, often related to a plant. So like 3 seagrass, 6 helicopter, I think is someone. Like there's a lot of very strange names, and like just getting past that was like very bizarre, and trying to understand like, oh, this is the name of this high up position. But yeah, so I found the world building was very complex to understand, but also it made it so much more enjoyable. It was so in depth and had so many layers to it. I was just sucked in. I was so engaged. Such high stakes, like so many different political plots going on that you're having to follow, and it just felt very realistic. Like, yeah, this is probably what it would be like to come like into a country where it's like so politically unstable, and everyone has their different schemes and ideas and thoughts and different like goals or aims that they're trying to attain, and you're just this newbie like being sucked in and trying to figure things out. Like it's amazing. Like it's so well written. 5 out of 5, honestly, 5 out of 5. Overall, the worst books I would say I read this year, and worst is like a very heavy hand, but you know, like I don't necessarily regret reading them, but they were the books I enjoyed the least, would definitely be The Penelopiad and Prisoners of Geography. My overall favorite books would be Babel, I Who Have Never Known Men, and A Memory Called Empire. And my honorable mentions would be Clytemnestra and He Who Drowned the World, but that's kind of cheating. Honestly, there wasn't a single book that I hated this year. I feel like I read so many amazing books, like especially the last like 6-7 were just all just absolute like bangers, one after the other. I was like, this is insane. It was such a good streak. At the moment, I'm currently reading Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. So yeah, really enjoying it. I'm not that far in. I'm about a third of the way in. It's really great. I've really enjoyed it so far. And the next book I have lined up to read is actually Butter. So yeah, a really great start to this year as well. I feel like I'm like really on it with my reading now. I was in a huge slump like last year, especially after Prisoners of Geography, and I was really able to like regroup a bit during summer and just powered through so many books. Honestly, rediscovered my love for reading this past year, I would say. I think part of that is just I forced myself to make more time for reading, and also I just really did come across some really good books that motivated me to like keep going. I still have a list of about 60 books to read, so yeah, I don't think that's ever gonna end, because as soon as I read one book I've added like 5, so it is truly endless. But what can you do? Thousands of books are being published every day, so that's really scary. Really amazing and beautiful, but it kind of saddens me that I'll never be able to read all the books I want to read. I guess that's the beauty of it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are. If you read any of these books, like, do you disagree with what I was saying or want to challenge what I was saying? Always open to hearing more opinions, and honestly, you could probably change my mind. Except about the age gap thing. You will not change my mind about that. Yeah, and if I motivated you to want to read any of these books, that's really great, because I kind of worry I didn't explain any of them properly. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this very, very, very long book review. Have a lovely day, week, evening, life ahead, and hopefully see you soon. Goodbye.